Morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. The Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics, meeting 123. Pursuant to Standing Order 1083H7, the study of breach of personal information involving Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. And today we have with us from the Conservative Party of Canada, Trevor Bailey, the Privacy Officer and Director of Membership. From the Liberal Party of Canada, Michael Fenwick, Constitutional and Legal Advisor, National Board of Directors. And from the New Democratic Party, Jesse Calvert, Director of Operations. We'll start off with Mr. Bailey, 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. My name is Trevor Bailey. I'm the Conservative Party of Canada's Privacy Officer. I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me here today to discuss our privacy policy, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have surrounding that policy. I've been the Privacy Officer for the Conservative Party for approximately 1 year, in addition to my role as Director of Membership for the party. The Conservative Party of Canada has had a formal privacy policy in place, including the role of Privacy Officer, for approximately 6 years. Though I am relatively new to this privacy role, I've held senior positions in the membership and fundraising departments for the past 7 years. In those roles, I've had or shared the responsibility to oversee our data, access thereto, and its authorized distribution. The Privacy Officer role is built around our party's commitment to protecting the privacy of Canadians. This commitment is important to the Conservative Party of Canada. That commitment includes taking great care to keep both confidential and secure all information in our possession that relates to the personal information Canadians willfully provide to us or is passed to us by Elections Canada as laid out in the Canada Elections Act. That information includes surname, given names, civic address, and mailing address. Other information the party may ask for and receive from individuals, like an email address, phone number, gender, and date of birth, is also information we include as covered by our privacy policy and is collected through our website or in response to a mail piece with that person's consent. As part of our privacy policy, any person may unsubscribe from our email, mail, or phone lists at any time using links provided in each email message or by clicking on our privacy policy in conservative.ca or contacting the party directly. As this committee would know, as a federal political party registered under the Canada Elections Act, the Conservative Party, including its electoral district associations, candidates, nomination contestants, and leadership contestants, are subject to extensive regulation under that Act, including in particular the public disclosure requirements for contributions over $200. As a result of these requirements, we collect personal information from donors and members when they contribute to our party or purchase a membership. You may also choose to provide us with personal information on a voluntary basis, such as when registering for an event or signing a petition. We are required by law to keep records of donors for tax purposes. The information the Conservative Party gathers, either directly from Canadians or as a result of legislative requirements, is used for communication purposes. As a political party, we believe it is very important to communicate with Canadians on a regular basis. We are a national organization, but we have a riding-based membership system, so personal information may be disclosed to local riding associations, candidates, nomination contestants, or leadership candidates for the purposes of communicating with those persons. There is some non-personal information that we track that is also included in our privacy policy for the additional information of Canadians. That non-personal information that may be collected through our website is through the use of web cookies with the purpose of informing the party how people use our website in order to help us deliver better content for those users or to assist in general advertising efforts. We inform people in our policy how to opt out of many of the advertising features used by sites like ours by adjusting their Google ad settings or through free services like the Network Advertising Initiative's consumer opt-out page. To wrap up, the Conservative Party employs a variety of security systems to safeguard personal information from unauthorized access, disclosure, or misuse, and from loss or unauthorized alteration. The Conservative Party does not and will not sell personal information. As I said in the opening, the commitment to protecting Canadians' privacy is important to us, and ensuring it's kept safe and secure is something we take great care in doing. If there's any questions on this policy, I'd be happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Next up, Mr. Fenwick for 10 minutes.
Thank you. Honourable members of the committee and Mr. Chair, it is a privilege to be able to speak with you today. I want to thank you for the opportunity of hearing from the Liberal Party of Canada on these important issues. My name is Michael Fenwick, and as I was introduced before, I serve as the Legal and Constitutional Advisor to the National Board of Directors. That's a volunteer position. And I'm also a riding chair for the riding in my home community of Parkdale High Park. So I also have the experience of working for the party and volunteering for the party at a local level. Both from serving on our party's board and from working closely with grassroots volunteers, I know the party takes the protection of personal information extremely seriously. I also know how the responsible use of data can significantly increase participation and engagement in our political process. Today, I hope to speak to you about both of those priorities, and I look forward to answering your questions. First, I want to outline our most fundamental commitment on these matters. The Liberal Party of Canada works very hard both during and between elections to engage as many Canadians as possible in our democratic process. Protecting their personal information is a priority for the party in all of its interactions and operations. As part of that commitment, the Liberal Party of Canada has a clear and strict privacy policy in place, which is posted on all of the party's national websites, and it can always be publicly viewed at liberal.ca/privacy. The highest level of security is implemented for all data and records that are maintained by the party. The party does not sell any personal information. At all times, the Liberal Party of Canada fully complies with all Elections Canada rules and regulations for political engagement and campaign activities as required by our campaign partners who do the same. Why does all of this matter? Because secure and accurate data is very important to how modern political parties operate and engage with Canadians. Like all Canadian political parties, the Liberal Party has uses data to engage with voters. Understanding the interests and the priorities of Canadians helps us to speak to the issues that matter most to them, and in turn, mobilizes democratic participation in our country. The importance of this objective truly can't be overstated. Political parties are not commercial businesses. We are not for-profit voluntary associations, defined in the Canada Elections Act as organizations whose fundamental purpose is to participate in public affairs by endorsing candidates for election. Our interests are very different from those of private sector entities to which federal privacy legislation applies. We promote candidates to Canadians. We informed in part by information about eligible voters and in accordance with accepted privacy practices and safeguards, and we safeguard the information that Canadians entrust us with. Using data to help engage voters isn't a bad thing, quite the opposite. It helps to ensure political parties are in tune with what matters to the electorate, and that more of us, are involved in elections. For as long as there have been free and democratic elections, successful candidates have worked to build detailed lists of their supporters to understand their priorities and return to them with an ask to help out at the polls. Knowing what interests are have motivated voters and who support our party helps us deliver relevant information and policy positions to Canadians. For example, we know that many more and more people, and especially young people, are seeking out new news and information online. For parties to be relevant, we need to have a strong online presence and interact with Canadians through the mediums and on the platforms they are using. That's why, in recent years, innovative engagement on social media and online advertising and email communications have become increasingly important to our operations. So, where do we get the information that we have about voters? Like the other registered political parties, we receive an electronic copy of the list of electors from Elections Canada each year. Under the Canada Elections Act, registered parties are authorized to use the lists to communicate with electors, including for the purposes of soliciting contributions and recruiting party members, in our case, registered Liberals. For all parties, using personal information contained in the lists of electors in an unauthorized manner is a criminal offense under the Act. It is punishable by a fine and up to 2 years of imprisonment. We take our obligations in this regard very seriously. In addition, we work hard to identify, engage, and mobilize potential supporters with phone calls, outreach events, door knocking, digital advertising, emails, petitions, and more. Often, we keep track of information about the issues that matter most to our supporters and to Canadians, and that information they express about whether they intend to vote for us. This information is recorded if it is volunteered by the individual voter and is used to inform the party's outreach efforts and political strategies at election time. On occasion, limited types of data are purchased by the party to help us reach out and connect with more supporters and Canadians. For example, in the past, we have purchased widely available phone book type information or Canada Post address validation lists. While we use social media to boost voter turnout, identify supporters through issues-based petitions, and ask for fundraising support, the Liberal Party of Canada does not have access to specific Facebook accounts beyond those of our own social media channels. Our party's primary voter contact database, a system called Liberal List, is a system called Liberal List. Certain individuals, including MPs, riding association executives, candidates, and campaign managers may request access to Liberal List. They can view the voter information for electors in their riding. Account holders are assigned certain levels of access based on our internal rules and policy, and must provide their name, email address, phone numbers, riding name, and address. All account holders on Liberal List must agree to be bound by a Liberal List user agreement, which sets out the terms and conditions for using the system. A copy of that, I understand, is with the clerk. Users must only use the data for the purpose of communication on behalf of the party with voters, donors, and registered Liberals. And they agree that they will not keep a copy of any of the data and will not share it with anyone else.
Mr. Fenrick, you're at time. You're about 15 seconds past. Is it just about just about your conclusion?
Yes.
Okay.
I will. I'll take one moment just to wrap up. The Liberal Party of Canada also has a strict privacy policy as well, which is in place. A copy of that has also been filed with the clerk of this committee, and we think it is a best-in-class privacy policy for protecting the personal information of Canadians. We hope that this committee will entertain seriously the submissions of the political party, the Liberal Party of Canada here, about the importance of political engagement as a guiding factor when considering these important issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fenrick. Next up from the New Democratic Party, Mr. Jesse Calvert. Go ahead for 10 minutes.
Hello and hello and good morning, members of the committee. My name is Jesse Calvert, and I'm the Director of Operations for Canada's New Democratic Party. I want to thank you for the invitation to appear and discuss our work with data and our privacy policies with you. The federal NDP and most of its provincial sections across the country all use software called Populous to interface with our respective databases of elector data, similar in principle to both the Conservative Party's Constituent Information Management System and the Liberal Party's Liberalist. The NDP, of course, has a unique structure wherein the federal party and the provincial sections share a formal affiliation with a common membership. While both the federal party and the provincial sections use Populous as a way to interface with their databases, the databases themselves are not shared. Information about electors is retained by the section collecting the data, and each section uses the voters list from their respective elections agency, the permanent voters list produced by Elections Canada in our case, as the backbone of their own database. With regard to membership lists, this information is handled by a single point of contact at the federal party and their counterparts in the provincial sections. Each instance of Populous is separate from each other. Populous is a web application developed by a third-party contractor. This same company also developed 4Action, which is used by NDP caucus members and staff to track constituent casework. These programs are totally separate. They do not speak to each other, and party staff, like myself, have no access to casework database. In terms of the data that we collect, like other parties, we use the Elections Canada Permanent Voters List, our own membership and donation lists, contact information from petitions, public data such as from the census, and data collected as a result of direct outreach operations. We only use this data in accordance with our needs as a registered political party, and we do not give it to third parties as a matter of policy. We do not use any kind of psychographic modeling, and any modeling or analytics we do is based on publicly available statistical information and not personal, private information. Nothing we use in these kinds of analytical purposes is more specific than, say, polling data or census information. We understand that privacy is a serious concern and strive to abide by the principles of PIPEDA. We have a designated privacy officer at the federal NDP and recently put into place an updated privacy policy which can be viewed at ndp.ca/privacy. Here are some examples of how the party protects Canadians' privacy. Every user of Populous must agree to a terms of use before they are able to access the NDP database. Internally, we have secure protocols that govern who can access our data, what they can access, and when they can access it. We abide by a principle of minimal access and only give users access to data that is relevant to their needs. For example, organizers in a given riding only have access to data in that riding. We offer electors the option to unsubscribe in every communication we have with them, and we have internal security protocols that ensure that in the event of a breach, data subjects are notified promptly. We are in the process of moving our data into the cloud using the same provider that the Communications Security Establishment uses for unclassified data. One gap between our practice and PIPEDA that is currently in place is that we are unable to provide Canadians with their data upon request and give them the ability to correct it. This is mostly due to a lack of a security protocol to verify the identity of individuals requesting their data. This is a problem that we are giving a lot of thought in how to address properly. In solving one problem, we do not wish to create another one. And it's for that reason that we support a legislative change that would give Canadians the right to request their data and extend PIPEDA coverage to political parties, as is already the case in British Columbia through their legislation, PIPA. We need a consistent set of clear rules on privacy and personal data that all parties can abide by. Thank you again for the invitation, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Calvert. We'll start off, first of all, with Mr. Saney for 7 minutes.
So thank you very much for all three of you for being here this morning. So I'm going to start off with a general question first. What protections are in place to keep the data you hold on Canadians safe? We can start with Mr. Bailey and go down.
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So there are really two elements to protecting the data. There is protecting against unauthorized access. So we're talking about data breaches and attacks on our systems. That's obviously a continuing effort for us. We have a great team on that. That's not my expertise, but I do know that we have very good data team in place, and we test our systems constantly. We host it in a very secure manner. And we try to secure it against any and all attacks. And so that's the one side, is the unauthorized access. The other side, of course, is authorized access, but inappropriate use. So that would be where someone who has access in a limited capacity to the database would access information and use it in a way that they were not authorized to do so. We have significant policies and processes in place to minimize that, the impact or the opportunity for someone to do such a thing. First and foremost is obviously limiting access to that data, so that only people, as my colleagues have mentioned, that have need to access it even have the opportunity to do so. Any of the information that they do access is logged, and they are required to request the reason for this access. And if and when it's used in an inappropriate manner, we have methods, both internally and if necessary with the relevant authorities to, we would cooperate fully with any investigation fully if there's any breach of our privacy policy and of course any laws. So there's the two elements to it. Protecting our data, we have a great IT team for that. Our data security is a continuing matter. I was just talking this morning about some of our firewall protections that we're updating. And then the other side, which is where people that have the key but want to use it in an inappropriate manner, that's where primarily our policies come into place, but certainly the procedures where we limit the breadth of access to data that any one user could have at one time.
For our part, many of the same things that Mr. Bailey has spoken to apply equally with respect to the Liberal Party and its treatment of personal information. So from the perspective of somebody outside of the system gaining access, we regularly run training. We've developed a cybersecurity policy, and we regularly run training with at all levels of the organization in terms of trying to ensure that people are educated about how to avoid things like phishing scams, like spoof email addresses, and matters along those lines. In addition to that, the Liberal Party's national director and the team at the head office here in Ottawa have met with the CSE in order to discuss best practices on how to secure Canadians' information. And that includes using cloud-based email servers, which is what is recommended from the CSE, and that has been implemented. On the access from users who have been granted access, who are volunteers, There's a number of ways in which we protect that information. Probably the most important, though, is that it's a segmented database. So you're only given access to the information on Liberal List that you need, and that can be as little as a single poll or in the case of somebody who's running a canvass. In fact, it could just be the canvass information itself for a particular block or two of a neighborhood. And riding association presidents may have access to the entire riding. Very few people within the Liberal Party have access to the entire list of electors, and our database is segmented in order to ensure that only the access to which you've been granted and to which you need is given to you.
Unsurprisingly, much of what my colleagues have just said applies also to the New Democratic Party. We have varying degrees of access protocol to ensure that folks who have access to the database only have access to the information that they are required to do their tasks, and only a very few number of IT professionals have full access to the information. We also have a terms of use policy that all users are required to read and understand and consent to before they are given access to their particular segment of the database. And we are also in the process, as I mentioned in my opening statement, of moving our database and our systems into the cloud, which will increase our ability to secure the information that's contained within it. In terms of guarding against security breaches, we have a number of internal security protocols that are constantly under review and being developed and improved upon. We have ongoing threat monitoring to ensure that if a breach were to take place, that we're able to respond quickly and swiftly. And we have protocols for notification if such a situation was ever to arise, to ensure that information that might have been compromised is that the folks whose information that is are informed that their information has been compromised if that situation were to ever arise.
So the last question I have is, obviously you can appreciate that there's a difference between a political organization and a private sector organization, and the sort of collection of data that each one uses for its own purpose. And in one regard, you're talking about a political entity that is using the data in the pursuit of democracy, and in the other organization, in a private sector organization, you're using it in the pursuit of profit. Do you think that these sort of rules should remain the same or subject to the same sort of standards, or should there be a difference between political parties and private sector organizations?
I could start off on that one. So you're absolutely right. They are separate. They are different. We currently operate under different legislative situation with PIPEDA coverage for private companies and not covering us as political parties. My role with the party is to enforce our privacy policy as written, and currently it does not come up to full PIPEDA compliance, which I believe might be sort of the suggestion there. And we operate, certainly cover all our legal requirements, and we follow everything as laid out in the privacy policy. But the decision as to whether or not we should implement or change the legislative background that covers us as political parties, I leave that to the Parliament and you as a committee. We're here to enforce the rules as written, and if there's a new rule basis that comes in and takes effect for how we need to operate, then we would certainly come into compliance. But I don't have an opinion as to whether it would it's required or not.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey and Mr. Saney. Next up for 7 minutes, Mr. Kent.
Thank you very much, Chair. Apologies for my tardy arrival. And thanks to all of you for coming today. It's much appreciated, and I think there's a very important discussion that we can have here today. In June, after 4 months of study of what began as the Cambridge Analytica Facebook aggregate IQ scandal, the committee, among a number of recommendations to government in our interim report, recommended that political activities come under the authority of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. Mr. Calvert, you've already spoken to that. As Mr. Saini pointed out, indirectly, an awful lot of the testimony that we heard with regards to the Brexit referendum and interference or attempted interference in the American political elections at different levels had to do with third-party intervention. I'm wondering if each of you could comment, and Mr. Calvert a little more explicitly, as to whether or not each of your parties believes that extending the authority of the Privacy Commissioner to protect Canadians' privacy in the political sphere as they are protected in the commercial sphere would raise any objections with your respective parties. I guess Mr. Bailey first, and then across the...
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. So once again, as you've mentioned, there was a lot of concern around third parties and their involvement. We certainly share that concern, and that we want to make sure that we have fair elections in this country, obviously, and we play a large part in that. So we want to continue to be able to participate in the democratic process as fully as we possibly can. That being said, as for whether or not there should be oversight by the Privacy Commissioner or enforcement of PIPEDA across political parties, once again, I would leave that to Parliament to make that decision. My role as Director of Membership and Privacy Officer is to protect our lists and to make sure that we take good care of them, and we make sure that everyone is treated fairly and evenly. And so anything above and beyond that would, if it came from Parliament, we would certainly come into compliance. But as for whether or not we should, I would once again leave that to Parliament.
Mr. Fenrick?
So from the Liberal Party of Canada's perspective, there are, obviously it's a critical issue that we need to address in terms of third parties, and I've already outlined some of the ways in which we are trying to both address those issues and constantly improve on them within the Liberal Party itself. From the perspective, though, or on the issue more broadly of PIPEDA's application to political parties, I think what we would hope that would be one of the serious considerations that this committee would take under advisement is the fundamental difference, and I would say founded in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the fundamental difference between political participation and political engagement and commercial activity. And our courts have recognized that in a number of places, including in protection of the freedom of speech, et cetera. We need to develop rules, if we are going to develop rules, that work for all people who participate in the political process in this country. And I say that from the perspective of a party that had 80,000 volunteers, I think, in the last election approximately. We need rules that work for the volunteer who's an 18-year-old, just got interested in politics, he's at a campus club and he's signing up his friends, to more sophisticated people who've worked on a variety of campaigns. And so from our perspective, whatever rules are developed need to recognize that fundamental reality that political parties are voluntary associations of volunteers, fundamentally, that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of volunteers to every paid staff member. And it would be a real disincentive to participation in the political process if people could face the kind of penalties that exist for corporations, for instance, under PIPEDA, for non-compliance. It would actually have a chilling effect, I believe, on our political process to do so.
Mr. Calvert?
So the New Democratic Party seriously believes that Canadians deserve to have trust in their democracy and to have trust in their political parties. We think that the only way to increase this trust and to increase transparency is to ensure that all political parties are playing by the same rules, and B, that there is the ability for oversight into the way that the internal party policies of the party are applied. It's that reason that we have been calling again and again for the inclusion of political parties within the PPITA framework. I do agree that there are differences between the way that political parties do their work and other types of organizations do their work, and certainly there should be thought and consultation when moving towards a framework, but we are very clear. We do think that parties should be included in PPITA. We do hope that the government moves towards that goal, and we believe that that will increase the trust that Canadians can have in the security of their information and the trust in their democratic process.
Thank you. Now, each of you has said that your party does not sell or distribute political data beyond the party itself. But if I could ask each of you to simply acknowledge whether or not your party buys data from data brokers.
Okay, well, I'll start off once again. Thank you. So we actually have a very similar process to as laid out by my colleague here, Mr. Fenrick. We receive our data from 4 main sources, and we're very upfront with all of these. The primary one, we don't purchase it. It's provided to us as part of the electors list from Elections Canada. That is 90% of our data, right? It is the information about who's an eligible voter that makes up the lion's share of what we have in our system. We do purchase data from 2 sources. One, Info Canada, basically the white pages. We buy the phone book, so we get some phone numbers for some to match up with those constituents that we get from the list of electors. The second one that we do purchase from is Canada Post's change of address list, so that our lists are as up to date as possible, because that is issued more frequently than the list of electors. And we try and reconcile those two. That is it. We don't purchase from any other source. The fourth source where we do get data from, which I think we should make clear, is that's provided voluntarily by primarily our supporters, sometimes by our non-supporters, but primarily our supporters. When they make a contribution, they show up to an event, they purchase a membership, or if they were to contact us and indicate their support one way or another, or answer a phone call, survey, things of that nature. But the only places that we do purchase data from, to be very clear, is Info Canada, which is the white pages.
We're at time, but Mr. Fenrick and Mr. Calvert, would you like to follow through with a quick answer?
Liberal Party Canada is very consistent with what my friend from the Conservative Party just said. Mainly things like phone book information and Canada Post information are examples. And really much of this is, for instance, with Canada Post information, is purchased in large part in order to validate donors, in order to ensure that we are compliant with our obligations under the Elections Act when we're accepting donations. So there's lots of reasons why we buy it. It's not just to communicate, but that is an important part of it, obviously.
Mr. Calvert, quickly.
I think generally the same would be said for the New Democratic Party. We also want to ensure that the data that we have with respect to address and mailing information is as up to date as possible, and we purchase information from from Canada Post to make sure that that's the case.
Thank you. Next up, Mr. Angus for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming. On behalf of the New Democratic Party and for my colleagues here, I'm asking that you don't target us individually for dragging your party's representatives into the light of day, and we're just doing our job here. I wanted to ask Mr. Fenrick, in 2012, 2013, leading up to the 2015 election, it was common wisdom, and I heard it on the radio and the media, how conservatives were really, really good at micro-targeting. New Democrats weren't so bad at it, but we were really trying to pick up our game, and that liberals didn't really micro-target. They did 1-inch wide advertising across the country, and seemed that would be a problem for the liberals in 2015. And then the election came, and you guys stomped us. And your micro-targeting was really, really, really good. So how did that transformation happen? Who oversaw the creation of a very impressive liberal data machine for 2015?
That's not something that I can speak to directly, but I would be happy to give whatever information I can to the committee.
So that's our leader calling. He didn't like that question. He wants me to re-ask it again. Sorry.
No. So my answer, Mr. Angus, is simply that I don't have that information available to me right now, but I'd be happy to identify
Okay.
that information for you at a future point.
So for the next election, it appears that your party will be working with Tom Pitfield in data sciences. Now, he did work on the 2015. So what will the relationship be between data sciences and the Liberal Party in terms of a digital strategy?
So I can speak generally in terms of our involvement with any third-party provider. We ensure that those third-party providers are bound by similar privacy obligations that we impose upon ourselves. So we include in agreements with third-party providers that their use of the data is similarly restricted in order to protect the privacy interests of the data holder or the personal information of those individuals.
But Mr. Pitfield was pretty impressive in 2015, so is that why you're working with data sciences, because of their expertise in doing this kind of data electoral running?
I don't think I'm the appropriate person to answer that question.
Okay, Mr. Bailey, one of the things we talked this morning about protocols and limits of access of databases, because in 2011, when we had the Pierre Poutine scandal, we had apparently a young staffer who was able to make calls in based on the Conservative Sims database. How is it possible that someone who, was a young volunteer was able to have access to the databases if we have protocols in place to limit so abuse doesn't happen?
Right. Thank you for the question. So yes, in 2011, the situation as described was in one riding. It was in the riding of Guelph, where the young individual you've identified was a member of the campaign in Guelph. He was a member of that team, and thus did have access to the database for the region for which he was responsible, which was Guelph. Certainly, the use of that data, in particular drawing non-supporter information with the purposes of deceiving those voters, was certainly a breach of privacy policy, both then and now, as well as Elections Canada law, and significant laws at that. So we certainly were not pleased with that, and that is certainly one of the reasons why we now have a league leading a privacy policy. We have changed not just the policy, so it's not just putting words to it, but the ability to access data has changed significantly since that time. And I'm very confident in the processes that we have in place at this time. The system at the time limited him to the access to only the region for which he had responsibility. So that was one of the key limits at the time, but his access was approved by the campaign at the time, which was one of the checks against access. So it was a breach of our policy. It was a breach of Elections Canada law. We have evolved as an organization because of it, not just with our policies, but certainly with our procedures and the ability to access data. So it has changed since 2011.
Thank you. Mr. Calvert, part of the reason that we're undertaking this study is because out of the Cambridge Analytica scandal is not just a question of political parties having data, but they'd be able to do the micro-target, the issue of manipulating voters online. So the question that's come up time and time again is data points that are collected by parties, the kind of psychographic modeling. Does the New Democratic Party have an identified number of points that you'd like of information per potential voter to know whether they're in our universe or not? How do you target voters? Are you using psychographic modeling or statistical modeling in order to identify where potential voters or non-voters are?
Thank you for the question. I think, like all parties, we're trying to talk to the people who are most likely to care about the issues that we care about, and we're trying to identify groups of people who are most interested in the issues that we stand up and fight for every day. And so we use publicly available data to do this. But the data that we use, the information that we use, is not personal information. It's not personally identifiable information. It's information that's publicly available and speaks to kind of trends and groups of individuals, because in the end, the goal of a political party is to engage Canadians in conversations, to learn more about them by asking good questions, and to improve upon our policies by listening to those answers. And that's what we try to do on a day-to-day basis, whether it's through our online outreach or through our door-to-door outreach. And we, yeah, I think that's kind of our mindset going into it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. Next up for 7 minutes, Mr. Bayliss.
Mr. Calvert, you said the NDP would be happy to be subject to PIPEDA laws. Mr. Bailey, would the Conservative Party be happy to be subject to PIPEDA laws?
Once again, I leave that up to Parliament and you committee to make a recommendation on that. My role with the party is to protect our lists and to follow our policies. I think we have a very good, really a leading
Okay.
privacy policy. But as for whether it should be in place, I leave that.
Mr. Fenrick, do you have a position on that?
Certainly not as PIPEDA currently stands. It just doesn't make sense to the particular context in which political
You feel the
activities
penalties are
operate.
too heavy? Do they compare to the BC? Like in BC, there hasn't been a drop-off, at least I'm not aware of it, great drop-off of volunteers because they're subject to the BC privacy laws. But you think that the PIPEDA laws are more strict than the BC laws? Is that your concern?
So I don't know the BC law in any sort of detail, but I do believe that the way that the penalties operate will be a disincentive to people participating if PIPEDA were to be applied. But I think it's important to have the complete context before
Okay.
making that.
But the penalties is what the penalties, and that you're saying it might worry volunteers. That's what's bothering you about the PIPEDA.
Absolutely, and as well, it's just sort of not well tailored to the political context where you're dealing with
Okay,
a
so-
mostly volunteer organization.
Whether you're subject to PIPEDA or some other laws, let's say we're talking about the parameters of use. So you have this database. For example, should you be able to commercialize a database? Do you have any thoughts on that? You've collected a ton of data. People are making money all over the place. We'll start with you, Mr. Calvert.
I would say absolutely not.
Okay.
Absolutely not.
Same. Yeah, we have no.
Now, if we take, say, for example, how about this? I have charities. Charities often swap data. That's how we've got this pool of donors. And if you tell us your pool of donors, we'll tell you our pool of donors. So now you're not making money off your database, but you've got a very valuable database, and someone else may have a valuable database. Not your competitors, but some other company. Should you be able to trade that data? Give them your data, and you get some of their data. So together you build a stronger database.
Canadians expect that the information that we receive from Elections Canada and gather through our outreach efforts will be protected and kept within our database. And so I think that that we wouldn't that's probably not something that we would find effective, efficient, or correct.
So that you should not be allowed to share it, even not for commercial benefit, but even for sharing to gather other data, like swapping data.
I think that that raises some serious questions, and kind of, if put on the spot, I would say probably not.
I'm not sure I have an answer to you other than sort of the more general answer, which is we don't do it. We certainly don't share our information.
You don't do it because you don't do it, but theoretically some fourth person from a fourth party could do it, and we're trying to figure out what parameters of use. Do you think we should allow you to do it or not?
I'm not sure that I have a position on that, but I'd be happy to get back to you on that.
So, I mean, as covered by our privacy policy, I mean, we collect it for the purposes of electioneering, of running a campaign, of contacting them for the purposes of winning an election. So what you're describing doesn't fit with our policy, so no.
It doesn't fit with your policies in what way?
In that it would be using our data that we've collected for another purpose, other than getting us votes in the next election.
So you're using your data right now you're writing the rules for yourselves. I believe we should write the rules for you.
Right.
So I'm asking you a question. I'm asking you the question in this light, and I'd like an answer now. Do you think we should allow you to do that? Yes or no?
Well, I mean, as I said before, if that's the decision of you as a
No,
Canadian Parliament.
but you're also saying the Conservative Party doesn't do that, and you're
Right.
comfortable with that, not allowing you. So you'd
Correct.
be comfortable with a law not allowing you to share that data.
That would be in line with our policy, so yes.
Okay.
Mr. Bayless, sorry if I could just interject with one more point, which is that, of course, the list of electors that we receive is subject to the Elections Act, and that's the primary point, I think, for all three parties in terms of the information we collect. And there are penalties, quite steep and important penalties, or quite serious penalties for using
That's
that
the list of
information right
electors
now.
that you've collected.
Yes.
Understood that. But then you've added stuff through your door knocking, through your phone calling, that this person likes pizza, that person likes hamburgers. How can we use this to sell them our political views, right? That's what I'm talking about, that data there. And you're saying you'd be comfortable if we did not allow you to share the data you're collecting.
As I said, I think that's a good suggestion, and if it fits with our policy, yes.
Mr. Fenrick, do you have thoughts on that?
I don't have any, I don't actually have a position on that right now. No.
Okay. Following up on what Mr. Angus was asking about micro-targeting, right now we might collect what's a person's religious leaning, what's a person's ethnicity, what languages they speak, things of that nature. Do you see a limit to how far we should allow you to go, political parties? For obviously, if we pick up, for example, this person is part of a hate group, or this person has some sorts of views which are not acceptable in general society, and yet you might be able to use that view. And we see this in politics, so it's not hypothetical. We see this, and that's used to push them a certain way. And that's part of what we found out, say, in this study and other places. How would we write parameters, or how should we have parameters to what we should and should not allow you to do and collect? So is there anything we should not allow you to collect? Mr. Calvert.
So the information we collect about individuals is the information that they give us. And that kind of seems like a good
So
place
if someone
to start.
says, yeah, but okay, someone says, I hate this ethnic group, you're going to collect that data? And
Well, by hearing it, we would have it. That's certainly not information.
no,
that's-
the person that heard it, but did you put it in your database as a data point?
I don't think so. I don't think we would.
Then you didn't
Be
collect
interested
it.
in
Then you
that.
didn't collect it. But I'm asking you, should we put parameters around what you can and cannot collect?
I actually haven't thought too much about that question. I think it's a good question, and we might be able to get back to you on more specifics about how.
Does your code of conduct, code of ethics have any limits on that?
I'd have to look into it. I don't believe so.
Thank you, Mr. Bayless. Time. Next up for 5 minutes, Mr. Gord.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for our witnesses for being here this morning. I have absolutely no doubt that you're completely sincere in everything you've said this morning. My own political experience goes back about 40 years. And even though we are now in the digital age, we seem to have learned nothing. 40 years ago, I worked with people who had, in their turn, been in politics for 40 years, and then we had election lists and we had telephone numbers on paper, and they were the right numbers. Everybody had paper directories, and when you received an election list, you'd have the right name and the right number, and in that particular house, you could have 5 or 6 voters with the same number. So that's not the case anymore. So year after year, I'm coming up to my 5th election, and the percentage of landlines is going down by it's going down a lot. Only 30 or 40% of people have landlines. We don't have access to those cell phone numbers, and it's becoming harder and harder to reach voters. 90,000 voters, for example, to reach them door to door. It takes a lot of work. We talk about profilings, and we believe that people will vote a certain way because they are a certain way. We have to profile them because we can't reach them, we can't talk to them, we can't phone them. So we imagine how they think, and we're using social networks. We're using what Facebook offers because we're simply unable to reach the people in person. Do you think we should have the right to get the cell phone numbers of people on voter lists? Because we get landline numbers easily enough, but we can't get cell numbers. And the problem is ever growing?
La question aux trois.
My question is to all three of you.
So sorry, can you you're asking whether we think that political parties should be given cell phone numbers through, say, the permanent electors list that Elections Canada generates? Is that your question?
Oui, c'est ça, c'est bien ma question.
Yes, that's exactly my question. Since we can get landline numbers from directories, at least electronic directories, we can get landline numbers, but we cannot obtain cell phone numbers because those numbers are considered confidential. There's no access to them, and many problems actually flow from the fact that we're unable to reach voters, and that problem is growing year after year. We are losing 1 to 1.5% of landlines every year because people die, and the younger generation does not get landlines. In 15 years, no more than 20% of Canadians will be reachable by landlines. So should we say that it's time to think about this very genuine problem?
Yeah, thank you for the clarification. I think that society continues to change and technology continues to change, and the way we do things has to also continue to change. The goal of a political party is, or at least our political party, the New Democratic Party, is to engage Canadians in meaningful conversations. And anything that, say, Elections Canada was able to provide to us to allow us to do a better job at that, we would generally be supportive of.
And on behalf of the Liberal Party of Canada as well, I think we are part of the reason that we were excited to have this opportunity today was to discuss how it is not just that we're going to protect Canadians' privacy, which is obviously of critical importance, but also how are we going to meaningfully engage Canadians in the 21st century in order to have those discussions. I'm not sure of the logistics around the particular cell phone issue, but I am aware of the statistics that you have cited to the committee here today, and I do think it's of concern that that it is more difficult every year for political parties to actually have discussions with their, not just with their supporters, but with all Canadians in order to provide an opportunity to actually understand what the electorate is looking for, which is why I think all of the committee members are in this business.
So just a brief response then, maybe 10 seconds or less, if you can.
Described the situation very well. That it's more access to data for us if it's going to be provided to us legislatively by Elections Canada. We put a lot of effort into acquiring that information, so if it could be provided to us, we would welcome it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Gord. Next up for 5 minutes, Mr. Picard.
Thanks, first of all, because the exercise you're doing hopefully will put back trust in our population, not just us, but our job is quite victim of cynicism, but we need ways to make sure that people can trust our institution, that that's the exercise you're fulfilling. My concern is about third parties, working with third parties. Do you sell your data to third parties?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
Okay, so do you rent your data to third parties?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
So you're saying that all the data we are working on in each of your respective organization stays within the organization, and any third parties that may want to access the data, well, how do they proceed if you want to access your data? Work with research center, academics, foundations that are supportive of your lines of policies. Well, how did you manage with dealing with third parties then? Go back first.
Right. We certainly are approached by third parties for that sort of thing from time to time. But as you know, our specific policy covers sharing with for our purposes federally, as well as the local campaign level nominees. And then we recently had a leadership race, and they were covered by that as well. But those are the only or separate organizations. Of course, they fall under the umbrella of the Conservative Party of Canada that we share our information with.
So other than sharing within the party itself with our provincial and territorial boards, not the provincial party of the Ontario Liberal Party or what have you, but our provincial, territorial board, which are part of our national organization, and at the riding level, we don't share our information with anyone. The only exception to that would be in circumstances where we have engaged a third-party supplier, and in those circumstances, we ensure that there are contractual provisions in place in order to protect the use of that data. It's not selling it, it's not renting it, it's using it in order to engage Canadians through a phone bank or what have you, in order to communicate with them.
We also do not sell or rent or share our data to third-party organizations. We, from time to time, contract with third-party providers to do work of the registered political party. We ensure that the contracts that we have with them include strict contractual obligations to protect the confidentiality of the information that they might have access to, and that they agree to fall under any of the privacy provisions that folks working within the party also have to fall under.
But the possibility remains that when we do work with third parties, as soon as they have their hands on data for the purpose of the agreement they have with you, we tend to lose control over what they do with the data, or is that safe? Go ahead.
So for at least for us, the protocols in place when that happens are very strict. If a third-party contractor requires information of ours to do the job that we've contracted them to do, they might have access on a read-only basis, but they don't have the ability to, say, download the information or copy the information or take it off premises. So certainly we think long and hard before we engage someone from the outside to help us with our work. And once we do make that decision, we ensure that the strict policies are in place and that legal and contractual obligations are instituted before anything happens.
By the way, in your presentation, you mentioned that you upgraded your system or you updated your system recently. What was the upgrade about in the policies or data protection? What was it about and what triggered that?
So we are in the process of moving our IT systems to the cloud. So we're moving away from on-premise, the holding of information on-premise, moving it into the cloud. I'm not an IT professional, so I can't get into the specifics, but it's my understanding that that is kind of, here in the 21st century, that's standard practice to increase security and increase a whole bunch of other operational abilities, one of them being the security of the data. So that's the process that's ongoing right now.
I feel generous. I'll leave you my 5 last seconds.
Thank you. Next up for 5 minutes, Mr. Kent.
Thank you, Chair. During this study of the Cambridge Analytica Facebook aggregate IQ scandal, we have heard repeated recommendations from academics, from IT experts, from social media security experts, that on the basis of what happened in the Brexit referendum, where confected third parties controlled and targeted advertising buys on social media, and the same thing in the United States, there was a common recommendation that a political registry of advertising buys be set up so that one could see transparently what ads were purchased by the political parties or by third parties, and how they were targeted. I wonder if each of you could comment on what your party position might be to that sort of registry to show how your advertising buys in the writ period or perhaps even the pre-writ period of a campaign would be applied.
Well, I can start on that if that's all right, Mr. Chair. So absolutely. I mean, we share the same concerns about third-party involvement in the election, and and this past election and one's upcoming. And so, if there were to be some requirement, some increased requirement for us to fully register all ad purchases across all channels so that that can be investigated at an individual level, because of course we are required to list all election expenses. So we are currently complying with that requirement. But if it wants to get to the individualized level, and if that's what's required to clean up the election, then I think that's something that we would be in favor of if that comes forward from Parliament.
Mr. Fenrick?
As well, obviously, Canadians have the right to expect an election that's not interfered with by third parties, and if that is a measure which goes some way towards addressing those concerns, then it would be one that would certainly be certainly should be considered. As I understand it, and I may be mistaken because I appreciate that all of you are much more expert in this issue than I am, as I understand it, Bill C-76, if it is passed into law, will contain some measures with respect to Facebook ads and other matters. So many of these issues may be addressed by that legislation, and when we welcome that.
I think that generally the New Democratic Party has and will continue to stand up for more open and more transparent elections. And as I've said, we do think that a political party should be brought into the PPEDA framework. And so I think that any measure that increases transparency, increases the confidence that Canadians have that political parties are all playing by the same rules.
Now, one of the loopholes that wasn't addressed or is not being addressed by C-76 is the fact that charitable American dollars that might have a political objective in determining or supporting or affecting a Canadian election can be effectively converted into Canadian dollars by being transferred from that American charitable group to the Canadian charity, which can then distribute it to third parties to be used in election campaigns. The witness that most effectively made this point, Vivian Krause, said that it's easy for any individual political party to say they take the high road in a political campaign if a third party is throwing the mud and making the political accusations on the campaign trail. I wonder if any of your parties would encourage the government to more effectively enable the CRA to respond to Election Canada's unknowns about how these foreign charitable dollars are getting into the Canadian election process.
On that one, if that's okay, Mr. Chair. A couple things. I mean, other than working with Elections Canada on C-76 consultation and any ongoing consultation on this matter, that's a little bit outside my purview as privacy officer and membership chair. So I'm not sure I can speak for the party on that particular issue, other than obviously we want to make sure we have fair elections going forward.
I think that's outside of my purview as well. However, I can say quite strongly that obviously the Liberal Party is concerned about foreign money and its potential influence on our election. But other than that, I don't think I can comment on that specific legislative suggestion.
I think New Democrats are certainly concerned about foreign influence, whether it be monetary or otherwise. And as I've said again and again, transparency is good. We believe in transparency, and we think that it increases the confidence of all Canadians in the democratic process. So without knowing the details of that specific recommendation, in general, transparency when it comes to elections, good thing.
Thank you, Mr. Kent, and everybody. Next up, Madam Fortier, 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will also be putting my questions in French. This morning, I realized that it's been 25 years that I have been involved in a party, even as a volunteer. So 25 years ago, we were not talking about these policies, regulations, and codes of conduct, but we do talk about them today. And we know how important it is to protect the data of Canadians. There are existing protocols. So I have some questions regarding what's happening on the ground. I believe the parties have established codes of conduct, but what happens on the ground? When I look at the Federal Liberal Association of Toronto, Vanier, how do you ensure that volunteers know that these policies exist? Can you quickly let us know how you ensure that on the ground people know how important it is to protect the data of the people they encounter? Mr. Bailey, you might like to answer? Or to begin?
Absolutely great question. We take it very seriously that we train our local volunteers. You're right, there are several levels of volunteer exist by their level of involvement. Mr. Fenwick mentioned earlier that there were that you can't be very difficult to impose stiff penalties upon someone at a lower level. So that works at a couple of different ways. One is you need to provide them training and only provide them access to what they should have access to. So we have most of our volunteers don't have access to any data. They should know that we have privacy policies and that they are covered by it because they are an extension of us during that time. But we need to limit the access to only those that truly need it. So that comes from training at the local level, comes from training of campaign managers. It comes from properly vetting all access so that we can effectively start up a campaign quickly and also be compliant with any and all regulations.
Mr. Fenwick?
Training is huge and key at all levels of the volunteer chain, including at the very basic level where people are out canvassing and have information. Obviously limiting access as well so that people only have access to the information that they need. And in addition to that, where people do have access, ensuring that there are protections in place. So we have our Liberalist user agreement where anybody who has access to it is bound by it and has agreed to ensure to hold that information and to return it at the end of their use so that they actually don't maintain any of that information, and so they're reminded of those obligations from the very moment that they begin to have any access to it.
Mr. Calvert?
Yeah, I think training is top on the list, and continued reinforcement of the importance of not just reading but understanding the protocols that are in place when they're given access or given a piece of information. It's why if you are granted access to a Populous Instant where you might have access to a segment of information, you actually have to log on and read through the terms of use and make take an affirmative step by saying, yes, I agree to this, clicking the button, and we try to write those in the clearest possible terms. That's why we have a privacy officer, not just to hear complaints, but also to be a point of contact for individuals throughout our organization to ask questions, right? I think you're absolutely right. Things continue to change over the last 25 years, and I think that certainly my generation, the younger generation, are very aware of the new world that we're living in, and so it's important for us to provide a point of contact for people throughout the organization to ask the questions that they have.
Puis pour poursuivre en termes de protection,
your parties protect information from third parties, but how do your parties protect against the unauthorized or involuntary disclosure of data to third parties by staff members or volunteers? And my other question, how are those accounts audited? How do you assess what's happening?
Mr. Chair. So absolutely, sharing information with third parties is a significant concern. As I mentioned, security of our data is split into the two methods, protecting the data and protecting against unauthorized access. I think we have an evolving, but we certainly have an organization and a leading privacy policy. I haven't mentioned it explicitly, but they certainly do sign to those agreements. We start from anywhere from as simple as certainly cutting off access, that's the first step, and investigating it, and cease and desists both to the individuals that have drawn the information and anyone that we believe has access to it. Legal involvement, our legal team will get involved quickly if we feel that it's been used and is requested, in fact demanded, that they destroy any copies of data if it came from our source and was used inappropriately. And then, of course, any sort of authorities that we need to go to for further, if there's other rules or laws that have been broken, particularly Elections Canada laws, which are pretty broad on this topic, we would certainly cooperate with any and all investigations because our data is our most valuable asset. So.
My time's up, but if ever you
brief
could
answers
share your
from Mr.
information.
Calvert and Mr. Fenwick. Fenwick?
So did I understand the question correctly? Inadvertent disclosure, is that the issue? So the Liberal Party of Canada regularly does training with its staff in order to address issues along the lines of when you get spoof emails, when you get phishing scams, and we regularly get involved in those sort of security processes to ensure that it's not that the information is not disclosed. And the second piece just comes back to the segmented database which we use, which not only is not just simply to provide limited scopes of access to users, but the database itself is segmented such that it is a more secure way of proceeding, such that information can only be accessed in tranches rather than the complete information.
Mr. Calvert, has to be a much quicker answer than that, so if you can.
Limiting access, ongoing threat monitoring, and extensive training.
That's well done. Last up, welcome back, Mr. Cullen. So 3 minutes.
Sure you're a Democrat, Jesse? That was awfully concise. That's not our... Let's try for concise. It's a little speed round here. Thank you for being here. It's fair to say that in order for your parties to be effective, you need to be able to communicate with voters. And in order to do that effectively, you need to understand voters at a individual level. Each party collects information on individual Canadians, correct? Voting intention, where they live, voter ID, just establishing, and that is increased over time in terms of the wealth, the depth and breadth of that information each of the parties hold about individual Canadians. Is that also true? Compared to like 20, 30 years ago, what we know about individual voters, is it fair to say it's increased significantly?
More response time, there's online contact. So.
Online contacts, social media. Yeah, is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. So this committee last June passed a decision that the parties should fall under privacy laws, PIPEDA specifically. Do you support that recommendation? I'll start with our Conservative friend.
I mentioned a couple times earlier in the room, I would leave that to Parliament. As a party, I mean, we would enforce whatever rules are placed upon us, make sure we're compliant.
Would you be able to enforce such a rule?
It would require significant consultation and development or redesign of our processes. But
you could do
if it was brought into law, we would certainly continue to exist as a party.
Mr. Fenwick?
We would not support the obligation of PIPEDA en masse and en bloc to political parties, in the sense that it doesn't, as it's currently drafted, is intended to address commercial activity. It's not intended to address political activity.
But right now we have no laws governing privacy in political parties. As it was described by the Privacy Commissioner, it's the Wild West. Bill C-76, which you referenced earlier, has, according to the Chief Electoral Officer, nothing of substance in it when it comes to privacy. So the status quo will continue, which is none of you are under any legal obligations when it comes to privacy as pertains to the federal laws. Is that right?
As it currently stands, there may be certain situations in which I don't think I can speak to that issue directly. What I can say is that PIPEDA, as it currently stands, is not an appropriate tool for managing political parties and political engagement in this country.
It's interesting because we even recommended one step down from PIPEDA, and your representatives from your party rejected that as well. The status quo is nothing. Chief Electoral Officer, the Privacy Commissioner, have all recommended that we have something. What's the New Democrats' position on this?
As I've said a number of times in this proceeding, as we have said as a party before and will continue to say, we thoroughly believe that all political parties should be playing by the same rules. There should be a clear set of rules, and we believe the way to do that is to bring political parties under the jurisdiction of PIPEDA.
So you're all keen observers of politics. You've watched the recent U.S. presidential election, the Brexit referendum that happened in England, the implications of Cambridge Analytica.
3 minutes goes by very quickly, Mr.
Let
Cullen,
me just end on this.
Yeah.
I want you to imagine, 23 years ago today, we had a referendum in this country in Quebec. I want to imagine that a similar referendum were held in these contexts right now, and that the political parties had been hacked because there hadn't been proper privacy protections in law. Imagine the results of that vote in Quebec, as there were in Brexit in England, where the suspicion and the reality of foreign influence over a referendum question, a pivotal referendum question in Canada, had been affected by outside sources. Would that threat, that is real, not present us with more urgency to actually do something about this in Canadian law that you apparently could abide by if we pass such legislation?
It's a great question to leave hanging in the room as we close today. Thank you all for coming today, Mr. Bailey, Mr. Fenrick, and Mr. Calvert. We much appreciate your attendance as the officially recognized parties to our committee. And again, thank you for your appearance today.